The last part of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 26, it reads like this. Now this is from the Living Bible. It reads like this from the middle of verse 26. The anointed one, and we know that's Jesus Christ, will be killed. His kingdom still unrealized. Now think about that. All right, Jesus would come on the scene. This is a prophecy. He would be killed, and his kingdom would still be unrealized, because all the prophets foretell of the time when Jesus will come to establish his government on earth for 1,000 years. All right, so here he would be killed. His kingdom would still be unrealized. Then notice what it says as it continues on in here. And a king will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. They will be overwhelmed with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. This king, and in the King James Version it says he, will make a 7-year treaty with the people. But after half that time, he'll break his pledge and stop the Jews from all their sacrifices and their offerings. Then, as a climax to all his terrible deeds, this is the Living Bible, the enemy shall utterly defile the sanctuary of God. But in God's time and plan, his judgment will be poured out upon this evil one. So this person. So in Daniel 9:26, it tells that Jesus Christ is going to come on the scene. He'll be killed. He will not establish his kingdom. That's why it says in Acts 3:18-21 that he's in the heavens now until the restitution of all things. And when he comes, he will establish his kingdom, and it'll be a world-ruling government and will practically eliminate sin from the earth. Well, this shows that someone would come after Jesus, and they would stop the daily sacrifices which the Jews are going to be having. And that this person would go on and he would do something in the temple area that would utterly defile the sanctuary of God. Well, let's go on. This is quite different from the King James Version. But the King James Version is a mistranslation, and it's really bad. That's the only way I know how to say it in this particular area. Because in the King James Version, it says, in referring to this one that would come after Jesus had already been killed, it says, one will arise and come and destroy the sanctuary and the temple and the city. And then it says, he. And most churches have looked at this word he and said that refers to the Messiah. And it says he, the Messiah, will cut off the daily sacrifices in the middle of the week. That is not true. It's not true. All right, let's go on, and I think we can prove that because I want to read several translations today. So this New Living Bible, could it be proper? I think it is. And what got me onto this is when I purchased the New International Version. I'll read it in just a minute. So this particular version is not by itself. I want to read another version, the Good News Bible. It says, now this was written and it was researched by a team of experts in the field of both Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek scholarship. So they are pretty good on this. Now I'll quote from this particular New News or Good News Bible. And at the end of that time, God's chosen leader will be unjustly killed. That's Jesus Christ. We know that. The city and the temple will be destroyed by the invading army of a powerful ruler. Think about that. Isn't that what happened? Jesus came on the scene. He was killed on Wednesday, the Passover. He was put in the grave for 3.5 days. He was resurrected at the end of the Sabbath. So when the women came to the tomb with their spices, early Sunday morning while it was yet dark, he was gone. He was already gone. But when did an invading army of a leader come? 70 A.D., Titus destroyed the temple and the sanctuary. They did it. But let's go on. The end will come like a flood, and I'm continuing the quote, bringing the war and destruction which God has prepared. That ruler, and in the King James it says he. This is not Jesus Christ. This is the one that comes and destroys the city and the temple and the sanctuary. That ruler will have a firm agreement with many people for 7 years. And when half that time is past, that's 3.5 years, he will put an end to sacrifices and offerings. Now get this next phrase. The awful horror will be placed on the highest part of the temple and will remain there until the one who put it there meets the end which God has prepared for him. What does it say in Revelation chapter 19? When Jesus Christ returns, he takes the beast and the false prophet and casts them alive in the lake of fire. This is going to happen at the very end of the age. A 7-year treaty is going to be formulated with the Jewish people or Israel to guarantee the state of Israel and their security. But now let's go on with the good news. So this good news translation actually agrees with the Living Bible. So both of those agree. But let's not stop there. Let's even go further. The Amplified Version. Let's listen to what it says. And the people of the other prince. See, Jesus came, he was killed, and then he had not received his kingdom. Now, this other prince is going to come. Who shall come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end will come with a flood, and even to the end there shall be war and desolations decreed. Now get what he says. And he, this other prince that's going to destroy the temple and the city, he shall enter into a strong and firm treaty with many for 1 week. Now the word here is Shabbat, the Hebrew word, and it means a week of years. So 1 week is 7 days, but each day is a year, a week of years. So it's a 7-year treaty. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. This is for the remaining 3.5 years. So there's 7 years, offerings and sacrifices for 3.5. Then he will break his treaty, the guarantee of a safe Israel, and then something's going to happen for the last 3.5 years. Now let's read the rest of that sentence. And upon the pinnacle of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the full determined end is poured out on the desolator. So Jesus Christ is going to come. He'll be killed. He did. He was resurrected. He's now in the heavens. He is not ruling on his kingdom. But one would come and destroy the temple and the sanctuary. Titus in 70 A.D. was a forerunner for the ultimate fulfillment, which will be at the end of the age, because we're going to see that this person who does these things is going to be sitting in the temple claiming to be God, and Jesus Christ is going to return to stop him. So we've seen 3 versions. They all render this last portion of the 70 weeks prophecy in a similar way. But now I want to read a 4th one, the New International Version. This is the one that got me on this particular subject. Verse 26. I'm going to start after the first sentence. Well, I'll just start with the first sentence. After 62 sevens, or 7 years of 62 weeks, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. Jesus would be killed, would not have a kingdom. The people of the ruler who will come, that's future, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Listen to this now. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. That's a 7-year period. But in the middle of that 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And one who causes desolation, listen to this, will place abominations on the wing of the temple until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Have you heard of Matthew 24, verse 15 and 16, which Jesus said one of the signs of the very end of the age is an abomination of desolation sitting in the temple, in the holy place? This is what he's talking about. But let's go on and let's investigate and see if we can't pull some real conclusions out of here today. So I think from reading all this that before we're through, we're going to find some very obvious and very simple and, I believe, irrefutable evidence that this is going to happen at the end of the age. Now, in order to introduce the 70 weeks prophecy, we need to look at Daniel 9, verse 21. And I'm going to read it out of the Revised Standard Version. I'm going to come in the middle of the sentence. Even the man Gabriel, so this is Daniel, and Gabriel's going to come to him, whom I had seen, this is Daniel talking, in a vision at the beginning. So here Daniel had a vision, and it was a previous vision. Note the word vision now. In verse 23 also of Daniel chapter 9, he says, I'm come to show you, for you are greatly beloved. This is Michael coming to, or Gabriel, I'm sorry, coming to Daniel, because Daniel had this vision. He didn't understand it. So Gabriel was coming back to give him understanding. Notice what he says. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision. So the 70 weeks. Let's go on over into verse 25. 70 weeks are determined. Okay, then on down it says, and to seal up the vision. So definitely the 70 weeks prophecy is talking about a vision which Daniel had. It says it 3 different times. And that Gabriel was going to come to make him understand the vision. Now, so the references 3 times to a vision are emphasized. But what vision? That's the whole point. And this is what has caused such misunderstanding in the book of Daniel. Well, the 70 weeks is not a vision. The 70 weeks is not a vision. So it has to be talking about something else. Well, in the next chapter, this is chapter 10, in verse 1, we read of a vision that Daniel had, but it's not a mystery. He understood it. It says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, or who was called in that particular Chaldean or Persian name, Belshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. It says he understood that vision. So there is a vision that is concerning the 70 weeks prophecy that Daniel didn't understand, and that Gabriel had to come back to tell him the meaning of it. Well, let's go back now to chapter 9, verse 21. This is a vision that had been in the past. Verse 21. While I was in prayer, Gabriel the man I had seen, past tense, earlier, in vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. So here's a vision that Daniel had seen in the past, and he didn't understand it. And that's what the 70th week's prophecy is all about. It's something that he had seen, past tense, previously, and he just didn't understand it. Now, let's go to verse 22. He says, this is chapter 9, verse 22. I'm come forth to give you skill and understanding. So Daniel now, it says many times in the book of Daniel that he had great wisdom and understanding. And yet here, this vision, he had no skill and understanding in this particular vision. So what are the conclusion that we read? Gabriel came back, and in verse 22 it says, and I, Daniel, fainted. No, this is chapter 8, verse 27. I'm sorry. Chapter 8, verse 27, about a previous vision. Because Gabriel was now coming back to give him understanding of a previous vision. Now look back in chapter 8 is the vision. Verse 27, it says, I, Daniel, fainted, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So here is a vision that nobody understood, and Gabriel had to come back to tell it to Daniel to try to get him to understand it. So Gabriel's words in Daniel 9 verse 22, I am come to give you understanding, that's talking about the previous vision which Daniel was sickened inside with this vision. He couldn't comprehend its full significance. He didn't know when it was going to happen, and that's why he wanted more understanding. So he needed the understanding that Gabriel was going to come back to give him. And this was Gabriel's second attempt. The first time he didn't understand, so now this is his second attempt to come back to impart this particular understanding of this vision to Daniel. Well, now, let's go on and note the vision. It starts in chapter 8, verse 15 and 16. And it came to pass when I, even Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for its meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice. Okay, then on down it says, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So here was a vision. Daniel didn't understand it. Gabriel was sent, and another angel apparently, and the other angel said, Gabriel, make this man understand this vision. Gabriel failed. Now, whether he was successful or not on the second attempt, we're not told for sure. We're not told whether Daniel ever understood. It was only said that Daniel, go your way. In other words, you'll die, and this is reserved for the end time. Now, There's a definite connection between the vision of Daniel chapter 8 and the 70 weeks prophecy. And this is where the understanding must be made so that we can comprehend the events that are just before us. The last section of Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy, is what's discussed. So when we examine the similarity in the vision and the latter part of the 70 weeks prophecy, I think we can begin to understand why they are interconnected. And it's the same vision right on through chapter 8, 9, and then a part of 10, and then 11 and 12, right on through. So let's read some of the verses now from the vision in Daniel, the 8th chapter. And it makes it obvious that we're going to be discussing the 70 weeks in the last verses of Daniel 9. Let's start with verse 11 and 12. Yes, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Isn't Jesus the prince of princes? He's the King of kings, Lord of lords. And this is a capital P showing that it is the same one as the anointed one in Daniel 9. And from him the daily sacrifices was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. That's the King James Version. But it goes on in verse 13 and 14. How long shall be the vision of the daily sacrifice, and the transgression making desolate, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? Notice what he says. Until 2,300 morning, evening. That's the way it should read. Morning, evening, because sacrifices. Because in Israel, they had a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice. They had 2 a day. So they were going to have 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. So if they have 2 a day, how many days is it? 1,150 days. So now, I'm getting things confused. But see, when I go through a few things, I'm going to make it real clear. But you've got to lay a little groundwork first. And it seems hard, but then the scriptures will just open right up and we will understand it before I'm through. I hope. At least I understand it. I hope you will. So this is the same type of terminology in these verses, verse 11, 12, 13, and 14, that we find in the latter part of the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9, verse 25, 6, and 7. So it becomes clear that the understanding that Gabriel returned to give to Daniel was the meaning of chapter 8. The vision he had in chapter 8, he was going to try to make him understand it in chapter 9. Now note the words in the last part of the 70 weeks. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. All right, that's verse 26 and 27. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consumption, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. So we're talking about, once again, sacrifices ceasing in both chapter 8 and chapter 9. Now, many people and many churches have read this whole section in here, and that they have used the word he as to who would cause the daily sacrifices to cease, to refer to the Messiah or the Anointed One. Now, you go back and you study English. Just study grammar. Simple grammar says that a pronoun must modify or stand in the place of the preceding noun. Simple. All you have to do is read it right in context. He cannot refer to Jesus Christ. He refers back to the one who's going to come, the prince after, that's going to destroy the sanctuary and the temple. It's the only way. Otherwise, you're defiling the laws of English grammar. So, if we look at it from that standpoint, suddenly it becomes very clear that it was not Jesus Christ who stopped the daily sacrifice, because he was killed and they were still offering sacrifices 38 years after he was killed. So he didn't stop any daily sacrifice. And he didn't destroy the city. He didn't destroy the temple. Titus, a Roman emperor, did. And then we're going to see that this prophecy was for the very end of the age. The very end. And Jesus Christ will fight this prince who's going to do all this at his return. Well, so we can see by these more modern translators, I read 3 of them, plus the New International Version, that's the 4th one, that these teams of translators and these, what you would call reviewing scholars, looking at the Greek language, they've rendered the last part of the 70 weeks prophecy as they have, that there will be a 7-year treaty, a covenant, and it'll be confirmed, and in the middle of that treaty, the daily sacrifices will be stopped. So the conclusion that we come to is that this could not be Jesus Christ. It could not be. It has to be the very one in the book of Revelation that is going to fight Jesus at his return. And I think we can go on now and we can prove it. So the vision of Daniel 8, this is for the end time. And I want to read some scriptures that will prove it. Verse 17. Verse 17 of Daniel 8. Understand, O man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. This is the time of the end. Now look at verse 19. Behold, I will make you know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. The last end. For at the time appointed, the end shall be. So he's giving the time setting of this vision. The very end. Now verse 25. He shall also stand up against the Prince of Princes, Jesus Christ. That nails it down. This whole prophecy is for the very end of the age. And this prince that's going to cut off the daily sacrifices. And he's going to establish the abomination that makes desolation in the temple, in the holy place. He's going to be the one that stands up against Jesus Christ when he returns. But notice what it says, the last phrase. But he, this unholy one, shall be broken without hand. What did it say in Daniel 2, verse 44? That there is going to be, in the very end of the age, a revival. The last world government. And it's going to be composed of 10 toes of this great image that Daniel saw. And there would be a great government. Someone would come and smash this 10 nation or combination of nations empire on the feet, and that person that would come would be cut out without hands, just like it says right here. Jesus Christ is going to come and smash this prince that's going to arise and stop the daily sacrifices in the middle of this 7-year covenant. So when we start hearing about a 7-year pact with Israel by somebody, then we know that we are within 7 years of the return of Jesus Christ. And I believe God wants us to understand this, and we'll get to that verse in just a little bit. But let's go on now. As the vision is shown to be in the end time, all these verses, 17, 19, 23, and 25, specifies it. We must realize there's 2 particular elements in the contents of chapter 8. First, there's the historical buildup through the empires up until the time when Alexander the Great. Because you see, you had, the book of Daniel tells, it actually foretold the nations. Babylon was the first world ruling government. Then you had the Medo-Persian Empire. Then you had Greece, the Macedonian Empire, and Alexander's death. So in verses 20 to 22, we see that it was prophesied of this Grecian Empire and Alexander's death, and this particular kingdom split up into 4 different kingdoms. And in verse, verse 20 to 22. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. The large horn between his eyes is the first king. That's Alexander the Great. History proves it out. So you had the Medo-Persian Empire. It was destroyed, superseded by Alexander the Great. Okay, Alexander then was killed. And notice what happened once he was killed, verse 22. The 4 horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from this nation, but will not have the same power. And they never had the strength once Greece fell and was divided up into 4 different areas. And you can find that in history. So there was 4 different areas. When this particular vision ends, we're going to notice that it jumps to the very end time. And it says so. Now, Daniel 8, verse 9. So the first 8 verses of chapter 8 is a description of the Medo-Persian Empire rising, then the Grecian Empire rising, and Alexander the Great dying, and the 4 kingdoms that come up out of Greece. Then in verse 9, suddenly something happens. At this point, the story jumps to the very end time, and we can prove it. So let's look at verse 23 and see the explanation. In the latter time. That's the last days. You can read through and through every prophecy referring to the end time, and it says the latter days, the last days, the end time. So the story flow from verses 9 to 12 of chapter 8 jumps all the way to the end time. And then verses 13 and 14 begins to answer or raise questions concerning the end time. And the central character of this entire vision is this end time little horn that it talks about. A little horn will come up and he'll stand up against the prince of princes in the end time. So we learn of the activities of this great military leader, this great religious leader throughout the remainder of the book of Daniel and also in the book of Revelation. And Gabriel gives an explanation. He uses such terminology, and you can read all this for yourself, review it. His power shall be mighty. That's one of the phrases he uses about the little horn. He says, he shall destroy wonderfully. He also uses another phrase, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And he also uses this phrase to describe this little horn. He shall magnify himself. That means he's going to raise himself up and magnify himself. Have we ever heard that in any other scripture somewhere? The book of Revelation and 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2, the exact terminology, but we'll get to that in a minute. He also uses this phrase in these chapters concerning this little horn. By peace. And the word should not be just peace, it should be prosperity. By prosperity shall destroy many. He uses another phrase. He shall stand up against the Prince of Princes, Jesus Christ, and shall be broken without hand. Those are all found in verses 23 to 25 of Daniel 8. So with this background, let's go on and let's see a little more about this little horn. Let's see some of the acts which he's going to be involved in. So the little horn in verse 9 of chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 9. It says, the little horn waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. Now, the word pleasant land, I believe everybody who has ever had any reading and dealing with the Bible knows that the pleasant land is Palestine, where God placed Israel. And he promised that whole area of Canaan to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then to Israel. And that's where Jesus Christ is coming back to stand in the temple in Jerusalem and is going to regather Israel. So this is what he's going to be doing. He's going to wax exceeding great. So the little horn, this is going to be the preeminent figure at the end of the age that's going to stand up against Jesus Christ. So it doesn't take much Bible understanding to equate the beast of Revelation chapter 13, which we've studied about so much, verses 4 to 9, with this little horn. To be exact, many sections within here, it practically reads, not word for word, but the meaning is exactly the same. I'll just give a couple of the quotes. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And power was given unto him to continue 42 months. That's 3.5 years. So what are we talking about in the 70 weeks prophecy? There's a 7-year treaty at the end, 3.5 years, and the sacrifices are cut off. But what's going to happen then? The last 3.5 years is the period that we have known as the Great Tribulation. But let's go on. I'm going to give just a couple of more quotes from Revelation 13, verse 4 to 9. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. And who did it say that would stand up against the Prince of Princes? This end time little horn. to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. Now let's compare that with Daniel 8, verse 10. It grew until it reached to the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. That's the New International Version. And now I'll give it from the Revised Standard Version. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints. No, I'm sorry, this is what I'm quoting now is still Revelation. Verse 7. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. And what did it say here in Daniel 8, verse 10? It grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to earth and trampled on them. And so even the saints are going to be persecuted during this period of time. We're also told in Daniel 8, verse 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Now, did you get that phrase? Not by his own power. What does Revelation 13 tell us about this end-time beast? His power is from Satan the devil. That's where he receives his power. And the little horn in Daniel 8, verse 24 says that he will become mighty, but not by his own power. Someone else is going to give him the power to become mighty. Verse 2 of Revelation 13, it says, the dragon gave him, the beast, his power. Verse 4 says, and they worshiped the dragon which gave power unto the beast. So you can see the terminology in Daniel 8 is the same as Revelation 13. The little horn and the beast. So the significance of this little horn becomes greater when we understand that he is the beast of Revelation chapter 13. And then it begins to demonstrate that the 70 weeks prophecy is completely tied up with the beast of Revelation chapter 13. So now, which part of the 70 weeks prophecy is this referring to in Revelation chapter 13? Which part where the city would be trodden underfoot of the Gentiles for 3.5 years or 42 months? Okay, let's start getting into that. I think that we can all agree that the last verses now of Daniel 9 is referring to the very end of the age. I think we can, because we've seen the little horn, and he says that it'll be for the time of the end, all the way down, and he would stand up against the prince of princes. So I think this man, and an understanding that he is the same one as Revelation chapter 13, will give us a comprehension of what his activities in the very end of the times. Okay. Verse 26 of Daniel chapter 8, or chapter 9, I'm sorry. Okay, this is from the Revised Standard Version. The latter part of verse 26, its end, this is the little horn, shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Now the Amplified Version reads like this. Its end, or the little horn, the beast, his end shall come with a flood, and even to the end there shall be war, and desolations are decreed. Now I want to read it from the Moffat now. And then ruin shall pour in with a flood of warfare to the very end. So the very end, there's going to be wars, there's going to be difficulties when this beast comes on the scene. Now, the Good News Bible reads like this. This is the last part of verse 26 of chapter 9 of Daniel. The city and the temple will be destroyed by the invading army of a powerful ruler. The end will come like a flood, bringing the war and destruction which God has prepared. So now we can begin to see what is happening with this little horn at the very end of the age. He's going to confirm a 7-year treaty with many people. Basically the Israeli people in the Middle East. And as the prophecy is relative to the temple, this wouldn't even be reasonable unless the many were the people who wanted that temple rebuilt. So this treaty must be with the Israeli people in the Middle East today who are wanting to rebuild a temple and start offering sacrifices. So I think that's the key that we as New Testament Christians need to watch for, and knowing how long before Jesus Christ returns. And when we can start looking up, because he does say in Luke 21, I think 28, when you see all these things happening, look up, because your salvation is drawing near. So if we understand this, then we're going to know ahead of time approximately how long it's going to be. So after half of this 7-year period in Daniel 9, verse 27, is over, then the sacrifices which had been initiated 3.5 years before because of this treaty, the little horn is going to break the treaty. He's going to stop the daily sacrifices, and then he's going to stop the worship of the true God in Jerusalem. Christ also referred to these events in Luke 21, verse 20. And listen to how he says it. When you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then in verse 24, listen to what Jesus said. This is his own words. They shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So this is what's going to happen in the Middle East. When we see armies, and don't we see a peacekeeping corps in the Middle East now under the auspices of the United Nations and the whole Middle East? So I believe something is going to be happening soon that's going to create even more armies that is going to stand up. Possibly even the world government under the auspices of the United Nations. I'm not sure how fast it's going to happen. It's according to how much groundwork they've already laid to pull every nation into the United Nations. But Zechariah shows that half of the city will have been taken into captivity by the time Jesus Christ returns. That's Zechariah 14, verses 2 and 3. But in Revelation chapter 11, it does confirm this time setting of 3.5 years. In verse 2, it reads like this. And the holy city shall they, referring to the Gentiles, with this little horn as their leader, tread underfoot 42 months. 3.5 years. So once again, the last half of this 7-year treaty is talked about. This little horn, break the covenant, move into the Middle East, stop the daily sacrifices, and tread down Jerusalem for 3.5 years. But what about the remaining 3.5 years of this prophecy? Daniel 8, verses 11 and 12 reads like this from the Revised Standard. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. In other words, he claims to be God. And by him, this little horn, the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And it cast the truth to the ground, and it prospered. So truth will be cast to the ground when this little horn rises up. So the temple is not left unscathed in all of these activities that's going to be taking place in the Middle East. So let's note now, once again, the time element introduced into this particular story and the vision. Verse 13 of Daniel 8. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression making desolate? So how long is it going to be? And it goes on and says till it's trodden underfoot. So how long is it going to be from the time that this treaty is made until this desolation, this trodden underfoot of the city of Jerusalem? Well, we know it's going to be 3.5 years. He's going to break the sacrifice, or he's going to break the treaty. Then there's 3.5 years left where the city will be trampled underfoot. But notice what he says. He said unto me, 2,300 morning, evening sacrifices. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, when there's 3.5 years, that's 1,260 days. But this says 1,150 days. There's a 110-day period left out in there, which it doesn't tell us in this prophecy what this little horn is doing. But I believe we can find out in Scripture, and we can be definite. I believe we can. Because the 1,150 days when there will be no sacrifices, no morning and evening sacrifices, leads right up to the very time when Jesus will return to restore. Because it says, then after this 1,150 days where there will be no morning and evening sacrifice, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And who's going to cleanse it? Jesus Christ, when he returns to restore all things. So, after 3.5 years, the sacrifices are stopped. The treaty's broken. Then there's another 1,260 days, another 3.5 years. But we're only told about the last 1,150 days. What about the first 110 days after the stopping of the daily sacrifices? Okay, I think we need to investigate. So the temple and the host nation, Israel, is going to be trodden underfoot for the last 1,150 days, leading up to this cleansing, or as one translation says, the justifying or the restored temple. Now, the Good News Bible reads it like this. It will continue for 1,150 days, during which evening and morning sacrifices will not be offered. Becomes clear. There's a 1,150-day period. Right before Jesus comes, there will be no sacrifices, period. But what's going to happen in that 110 days? We're going to get there. Then it goes on in that verse that I was just reading in the Good News Bible. It says, after this 1,150 days when there'll be no offerings, then the temple will be restored. And everyone who understands a little of Bible prophecy knows that's when Jesus Christ returns. So as the city of Jerusalem, it will be in captivity for the last 3.5 years. And it'll be released out of captivity when Jesus Christ returns. You can find that in Zechariah 14, the whole chapter. And how people will come back and they'll start keeping the Feast of Tabernacles again. They'll come up to worship the Lord of hosts. And in verse 9 it shows that the whole earth will be ruled by Jesus Christ at that time, after the destruction. And when Jesus comes back to take this little horn, or the beast and false prophet. So Zechariah 14, 2 and 3 goes on through and shows the events of the destruction of Jerusalem and Jesus Christ returning to lead it out of captivity. Then the survivors will very quickly begin to go back to Jerusalem, that when this temple is restored, and they'll worship Jesus Christ there, and they'll keep the Feast of Tabernacles. But note that the question of the length of time that this host, or the Israeli people, the Jews around Jerusalem, is trodden underfoot. All right, it's 1,150 days, and this will be released when Jesus returns. So the temple will lie desolate for this period of time, the final part of the 7-year period. But there is a period of 110 days that's unaccounted for out of the 1,260. So this 7-year treaty is broken. It's in the middle of the week. The abolition, the stopping of the daily sacrifices by the Jews. And in the final 3.5 years, remember the very end, 1,150 days, that marks the time when the temple is lying completely desolate. So there remains a 110-day period before this cutting off of the temple activities and the casting down of the temple that we must account for. So what happens during this period? What makes the temple desolate? What happens in this 110-day period that's going to be so horrible and so awful in the sight of God and in the sight of the people living in Israel? The Jewish people who are going to live there, and suddenly their temple something is happening in the temple area that is so terrible that they're going to want to rise up and cause the desolation of the temple rather than see that activity take place. So why is it that the host or the Israeli people are going to suddenly turn upon and cast down their own temple and the sanctuary, and it'll lie desolate for 1,150 days? Well, the little horn, remember, has made a conquest of Jerusalem. So what is the abomination of desolation that Jesus Christ referred to in his Olivet prophecy? Well, we can find out. From the Living Bible, I'm going to read about the 70 weeks prophecy. He will break his pledge and stop the Jews from all their sacrifices and their offerings. Then, as a climax to all his terrible deeds, the enemy, that's the little horn, will utterly defile the sanctuary of God. He's going to do something that's going to so utterly defile the sanctuary that the host nation, the Israelis, the Jews, are going to think he's so contemptible, they're willing to destroy their own temple to keep him from performing these acts. Now, the Good News Bible says And when half this time is past, that's half of the 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifices and offerings. Now get this. The awful horror will be placed in the highest point of the temple. A terrible horror in the eyes of any religious person who serves the true God is going to be placed in a point of the temple. Something's going to happen. So let's for a minute just go back to the New Testament, to 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2. And let's take a look and see what is prophesied by the Apostle Paul and what he wrote to the Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2. Okay, let's start in verse 2. The time setting is identical. I'm going to read verse 1. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is what he's writing to the people. The Thessalonians wrote to Paul and said, well, look, what's it going to be like when Jesus comes? We want to know. And our being gathered to him. All right, now, note verse 2. We tell you not to be easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. So don't let anybody tell you that the day of the Lord, when Jesus Christ would return, the events prophesied in the book of Daniel has already happened. Don't let anyone tell you the events surrounding the temple have already occurred. That's what Paul was telling these people. None of these prophecies have happened. So don't let anybody tell you they have. For that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped. And what did it say back in the book of Daniel? This person was going to exalt himself, magnify himself to the host. He was going to claim to be God, this little horn, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now verse 8 says this of 2 Thessalonians 2. Then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan. This is the little horn, the beast, the one that's going to move into the temple after he stops the daily sacrifices. He's going to move into the temple that 110-day period. He's going to claim to be God, and he's going to force people to offer sacrifices to him on the altar of God. And that's why they're going to rise up and destroy the sanctuary. And the last 1,150 days, there'll be no sacrifices because the temple will be destroyed. I think we can show that in just a minute. But he's going to come there, and his power is going to come from Satan, because it says his coming, whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. No wonder the people are going to think that he's God sitting in the temple. They're expecting Jesus Christ to return, and suddenly he moves in, he takes over, he moves in at all these powerful miracles. Who knows? It could be that the very first day when he moves in and claims to be God, and they kick off the offering of sacrifices to him by miracles, by bringing fire down from heaven in the sight of all men. Wouldn't that be a tremendous thing, to bring fire down from heaven, to set fire to the sacrifices on that altar, to him, to prove that he was the God that the people of the earth should be worshiping? He is the Messiah. Think about that. Not doctrine, just a thought process there to run through your mind. So while we have customarily, many people, and many in the Church of God, because they've looked at the Catholic Church, they've seen that the Pope is a false prophet, but they have customarily assigned this passage in 2 Thessalonians 2 to a false prophet. This is not true, though, because it says very clearly in Revelation 13 that they're going to worship the beast, not the false prophet. The false prophet is going to cause all who will not worship the beast, the emperor, the world dictator, as the Messiah and as God. And if they won't worship him, they'll be killed. So it says that very clearly in Revelation 13, verses 11, or actually verse 4, all the way through the remainder of the chapter. So remember, all of the ancient emperors of the Roman Empire all wanted to be worshipped as God. And they were. Just study the history books. You can see it. All the emperors elevated themselves. They claimed to be God, and it was emperor worship. And it's going to be the same, because you see, Satan has inspired all the rise of all the world governments. And it's not going to be any different. And Satan is going to be worshipped through this beast power. So this person in the end time who exalts himself above all that is called God, above all that is worshipped, and sits in the temple of God, and he claims that he is God. Can it be anybody else besides the beast of Revelation? Because when you look at all the passages in Daniel about this little horn and how he cuts the sacrifices in half, then I believe it becomes very obvious that it's talking about the same individual. And he's going to magnify himself so great before the people that they're going to worship him as God. So I think the book of Daniel and Revelation go hand in hand, and you can't understand the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel without the book of Revelation. And it all just fits together like a hand in a glove. So during this 110-day period, while this little horn is sitting in the temple of God and claiming to be God, let's go on and see what's happening. So we've seen already that it's the same as the beast of Revelation 13. Now note that the same events are described. Verse 4, they worship the beast, the same as they did to the little horn. This is verse 4. And there was given him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, the same thing that the little horn did. He magnified himself against the prince of the host, and he spoke great swelling words of blasphemy. Verse 6 of Revelation 13 talks about the beast. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle. That's the sanctuary. Then in verse 7 it says, and it was given unto him to make war against the saints and to overcome them. So when you talk about the little horn and you talk about the beast of Revelation, they're talking about and describing the same activities. Now let's go back to Daniel 8. Let's go back to Daniel 8 now. I realize this is a lot of jumping back and forth and skipping, so you might want to get the tape and just stop it and then read that particular verse and then go on and read the next verse, because there's been a lot of jumping back and forth, but I think it's essential. That's why I put it all in notes today instead of trying to remember. Now, Daniel 8. What is the transgression that makes desolate? The little horn, or the beast, while he is sitting in the temple, it's not going to be destroyed while he's sitting in the temple. But Satan, his inspirer, the one who gives him power, is going to want the temple preserved. Why? Because he wants to be worshipped. That's all he's ever wanted. He wanted to overthrow God all the way back. In Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, he wanted to be the supreme ruler of the universe. He wanted all the angelic host, all human beings to worship him as God. So Satan doesn't want the temple destroyed. He wants that beast sitting in the temple claiming to be God, because he is the one who possesses this person and gives him power. So in reality, when they worship the beast, they're worshiping Satan. That's what he wants. So the temple will be profaned by those who have very strong feelings about the sanctuary. And after the first 3.5 years, when those sacrifices are cut off, how are they going to feel about their enemy who comes into the Middle East? He takes over, he tramples down their city, then he moves into the temple, and he begins to blaspheme their God and claims that he is God and they must worship him. Think about this a minute. What if you were an Israeli in the Middle East, or even a Christian in the Middle East, and what if you didn't buy the story that he was God? But what if he set up something in the temple? An image. And what if that image had been computerized? And what if it also forced everybody to take a mark on their right hand or their forehead so that you couldn't buy or sell? And what if you didn't worship that image and the beast as God? You were going to be killed. Now, would you put your life on the line in order to try to overthrow that thing and destroy the sanctuary so that that abomination to you could not sit in the temple? Think about that for a minute. I think that the Israeli people will definitely, those who don't buy the idea that this end-time dictator is God and the image that he establishes that speaks and causes all to have a mark on the right hand or forehead, when they don't buy this, I think they're going to rise up and they're going to try to overthrow him. And I think we've got a scripture to prove it. So why did the little horn turn on the host, which one of the scriptures says that we've read? I don't think it'll come as any surprise to any of us that if you were there and you did not accept this as the true God, but you were being forced to worship it, that you would rise up in outrage if you were going to be killed anyway if you wouldn't worship it. You see, what have you got to lose? You're going to be dead whether you try to overthrow this and get rid of this abominable thing, or whether you just don't worship it and they cart you off to the gas chambers. It doesn't matter. You're going to be dead either way you go. So why not try to destroy it? Well, in Daniel 8, verse 12, and this is the marginal rendering, which is a better translation than the way they said it. It says the host nation in Jerusalem, the Israelis, was given over for the transgression against the daily sacrifice. Now, as this follows the time that the sacrifices had already been cut off in the middle of the week, it goes on to follow then that the sacrifices had been reintroduced. Here this guy came into the temple, the little horn, the beast. He cut off the daily sacrifices. The Jews couldn't offer them, but they reintroduced them. According to verse 12, in the second half of this period. But it's not to the God of the heavens which we worship. It's not to Jesus Christ. But instead, it's to this false god, the beast, who sits in the temple and claims to be God. So he's going to force the offering of sacrifices to this personality. I think this becomes very interesting, because in the book of Revelation we find there is a false prophet. And it says that he does great wonders, so that he makes fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men, and deceives them that dwell on the earth by means of those miracles which he has power to do in sight of the beast. So could it be that these powerful miracles may be as they say in many movies that come out, the special effects that's going to deceive the world into thinking this personality, the beast, is God, and they should reintroduce sacrifices to him? Could it be this fire that is brought down from heaven would accompany the opening ceremony? I'm just throwing out some things to think about. Not absolute doctrine, but think about it. And then let's consider. I don't think we've understood quite how dramatic this is going to be and how terrible it's going to be. But if fire was brought down from heaven in the sight of all men, and especially this host nation, the Israelis, and the opening of sacrifices in the second 3.5-year period, but only they were offered to this god, the beast, or this man claiming to be God, wouldn't that deceive many people? It says that it would deceive them. Well, let's go back to Daniel 8, verse 12. The Good News Bible. It's very interesting. It says they stopped the daily sacrifice to him. Wow. This is talking about the little horn, or this one that comes up, the beast. So they are reintroducing daily sacrifices after they cut the Jewish sacrifices off after 3.5 years. Then suddenly they reintroduce sacrifices to him, the beast. But then in verse 12 it shows that they stop the daily sacrifice to them and they desecrate the temple. And it lies there for the last 1,150 days with no sacrifices. And then Jesus Christ returns to restore it. This is a possibility. At least that's what it seems to be saying here. But we're not told how long it'll be before the new sacrifices are actually begun to this person. I'm sure he's not going to stop them one day and the next day he reintroduces them, because it's going to take a little time for him to take over, move this beast or this image of the beast into the temple, and it's going to take a little time. But we do know that their termination of all these sacrifices to this beast system will be 1,150 days before the return of Jesus Christ. Then the temple will be restored and cleansed. In verse 26 of chapter 8 it says, "And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told was true." So we know that of a truth, once those sacrifices stop for sure, it'll be 1150 days till Jesus Christ returns to this earth. And this is all yet before us. Because we're told, and when Daniel asked, he wanted to know, and he was told how long before, and this is the answer that he got, 1150 days, 2300 morning and evening sacrifices. But what about the massive damage that's going to be done to the temple? It's not clear just how massive it's going to be. But from the King James Version, I'll read just a couple of phrases. It says, "The place of the sanctuary was cast down." That's one of the phrases used. In the Moffat, it says it was demolished. The Revised Standard Version says that it's overthrown. So we can understand that there will be no altar to offer sacrifices. So it's going to be destroyed. The fact that someone would possibly even challenge this new God, as he's going to claim to be, sitting in the temple, and then even successfully, you might say, puncture his almighty image, might have something to do with the destruction of this temple. And I think it's vital that we understand that there's going to be a lot of activities going on that we can't even comprehend. But this little horn is definitely going to be involved in the Middle East and the world. So the story of these 110 days right after the 3.5 years of sacrifices has stopped by the Jews is not complete yet. Let's go ahead and take a little more from Scripture and see if we can't come up with the answers. So we found all we can in Daniel 8 and 9. But Jesus gave a little more information in the Olivet prophecy in Matthew 24, verse 15. He says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place." Okay, then you know that the desolation is coming close. Now the Revised Standard Version says this, "So when you see the desolating sacrifice," remember, if they reintroduce sacrifices, but to this false god, this man claiming to be God, so when you see the desolating sacrifice spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then you know that the desolation of the temple is coming close. Now the Amplified uses the word standing also. Now the Good News Bible says this, "It'll be standing in the holy place." The Living Bible says standing, but it says you know what is meant. So we need to know what is meant by standing in the holy place during this 110-day period before the temple and the sanctuary is destroyed for the last 1150 days before Christ returns. But do we know what's meant? That's the question. And I think we need to explore that just a little bit, see if we can come up with an answer, and then study more to make sure that we really know. So we know that the little horn, this man of sin, as he's called in 2 Thessalonians 2, will sit in the temple, he'll claim to be God. But what's standing there with him in the holy place? Christ told us to seek the answer from Daniel. Okay, that's what he said in Matthew 24:15. That takes us to one scripture in Daniel, and there is no other. One place. And it takes us directly, and it will give us a time setting. And many churches have used this particular verse to show that Antiochus Epiphanes, which he did, offered swine's blood on the altar in 68 BC. Or was it 168? I believe it was 168 BC. We'll have to check that. I don't remember offhand. So it takes us to Daniel 11, verse 31. This is the only place where it talks about it. "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate." That's what Jesus said. You can know within 3.5 years of the time when he'll return, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of in this verse placed in the temple. Now let's look at some of the other versions to see how they put this. The Revised Standard Version. "They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." The Moffat says, "an appalling abomination erected." So something's going to be set up. The Amplified reads like this: They shall set up in the sanctuary an abomination that astonishes and makes desolate. So if it's going to make it desolate, and we've seen that they are going to stop sacrifices offered to this new God, claiming to be the true God, so this is probably, it has something to do with a sanctuary effort or area and an idol altar, probably. Now the Good News Bible says, they shall set up the awful horror. All of these phrases showing that it's going to be something terrible, and Jesus spoke of it as a sign to us Christians how soon He's going to return. So there seems to be little doubt in all of these phrases that it's going to be some type of an image that's erected. It's set up in the temple. Just as there was an image of Jupiter Olympus set up in the temple in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. He set it up in the Holy of Holies in the very temple of God. Now these events described in Daniel 11 are yet future. It's for the end of the age. There's been, well, no real past fulfillment except in type. God uses prophecy in duality. Here is one thing that happens, but the greater fulfillment is for the end of the age. That's why they say history repeats itself. Historians have even seen that. And it's true, it does, because God has made it that way. The visions of Daniel 10, 11, and 12 is all one vision, and it's dated for the end time. And if we understand that, then we can understand what's going to happen. We'll have to return to these in just a minute and zero in on verse 31, because it is the clear sign given as how close we are to the end of the age when we see that. But Daniel was very perplexed. He didn't understand these events that were going to occur in the last 3.5 years. It says so. And the Good News reads, how long will it be until these amazing events come to an end? That's verse 7 of Daniel 12. And he says it'll be 3.5 years. A time, times, and half a times. So he does specify 3.5 years. So when the persecution of God's people, the church, which we've seen in Revelation 12, Revelation 13, and even those Jews who are waiting for the true Messiah and who have not gone into this apostate, false, final world government, they're going to know that this is not true. So this is clear enough that those minds who have not been programmed into other type teachings, that we can begin to see what's going on. So Daniel stated in Daniel 12 verse 8, but sir, how will it all end? He wanted to know. He wanted Gabriel to tell him. But notice what Gabriel told him. You must go now, Daniel, because these words are to be kept secret, hidden until the end comes. How could anybody understand these things until they are about to happen and God's Holy Spirit allows and gives the understanding of them? It couldn't. It says from the time the daily sacrifices are stopped, and it's referring back to the vision in Daniel 8 and 9. The 70 weeks, the daily sacrifices are stopped. That is from the time of the awful horror. So when the statue, this image, whatever it is set up in the holy place, 1,290 days shall pass. You can bank on it. 1,290 days from the time we see this, whatever it is, the abomination that causes desolation set up in the temple, then Jesus Christ is going to return. So the events of Daniel 31 are timed to be, or Daniel 11 verse 31 about this image that's going to be erected in the holy place that's going to cause desolation, is timed to 3.5 years from the end of the age when Jesus Christ will return. But that's the Good News version. Now let's go on and read the Revised Standard. And from the time that the continual burnt offering is taken away, that's 3.5 years into the 7-year treaty, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. That brings it home. The King James Version, the Amplified, and also the Moffat translation reads similar to this. Not exact, but it has the exact same meaning. So the timing of the central events of the longest prophecy in all the Bible, Daniel 8, 9, 10, 11, and run on into chapter 12, is time for 3.5 years from the end when Jesus Christ will return. So why was the prophecy to be sealed until the time of the end? Why seal history until it's already over, or practically over? Well, the vision of the last 3 chapters of Daniel is one, and it's time for the end. Daniel 10 verse 8 says, "Therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision." Then in verse 14 it says, "Now I am come to make you understand." This is Gabriel, came back to make Daniel understand what shall befall your people in the latter days, the very last days, 3.5 years before Christ's return. For yet the vision is for many days, a long way off yet. So Moffat writes it like this: "Now I am here to let you know what is to befall your people at the end of the ages." And what did Jesus say in Matthew 24, verse 1, 2, and 3? The disciples said, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world?" And the word world is A-I-O-N in the Greek, which is aeon, and it means end of the age. And so it absolutely locks it in with Matthew 24 and the book of Daniel. And it says, "For the vision relates to the far future," and that's the end of the age. Well, Christ was telling them that the temple, 3.5 years before the end, something appalling, some horror would be set up. And I think we can begin to find it. And this would actually be the sign telling of the destruction of the temple. So now let's find and come to a conclusion of everything this morning that I've talked about. The bulk of the book of Revelation, most of the book of Revelation deals with the events of the day of the Lord. Revelation 1 verse 10 talks about John being projected forward into the day of the Lord. Revelation 13 stands as the very section of Scripture which specifically deals with the seals and the trumpets to be opened, and then this very end era, the very end era is Revelation 13. Chapter 12 reveals that there is a coming battle in the heavens. Michael and his angels are going to throw Satan and his demons back to the earth, and he's going to know that he has but a short time, and that's when he's going to give rise to this end times social system called the beast or the little horn. And he's going to go out to make war against the church. And it says so in Revelation 13 verse 7, but it also says it in Revelation 12, the last couple of verses. This end time system is going to make war against the church. And now the next chapter, 13, it continues the story with the emergence of the beast. This final little horn is coming on the scene. And notice now, in verse 4 it says his seat has great authority. Verse 4, they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast? Who can fight against him?" Then verse 5, the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months, the last 3.5 years. So this is the exact same time element. Because the reason we know is because in Revelation 19, verses 11 to 19, Jesus Christ returns from the heavens. He takes this beast and he casts him into the lake of fire. So Revelation 13 and Daniel 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12, all are the exact same events. One explains the other. And so that we can get an overall understanding. Verse 7, Revelation 13. Also it was allowed, this beast power was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. So now, we have a background. Now let's start to understand where the false prophet fits into this. The second half of this chapter, Revelation 13. It says, another beast in verse 11, like a lamb. This is a religious connotation. And yet he speaks like a dragon, like Satan the devil. Then notice in verse 12, it says he exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence. So this false prophet is going, when he's in the presence of the beast, he's going to be able to speak and have full authority, but it's delegated from the beast, the world dictator. And he makes the earth and its inhabitants to worship the first beast. So the false prophet is going to force everyone to worship the beast, the world dictator. Verse 14, by the signs which it, the second beast, the false prophet, is allowed to work in the presence of the beast. Notice they're going to deceive the world. It says it deceives them who dwell on the earth, bidding them to make an image. Here we go. Make an image or a statue for the beast. And it was allowed, this false prophet, this second beast, was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast so that this image could even speak. That's dynamite. And cause those who will not worship the image of the beast to be slain. We could not have understood this until the 20th century. Now, even in Omni magazine, I forgot which month that was, but it actually shows a robot which is totally computerized and it looks just like a man. They could actually make an image looking just like the world dictator, set him up in the temple. They would worship him as God. Why? Because he looks just like the other guy. And then he could be totally computerized so that, let's go on and see what else he's going to do. Now notice, he created this image, and the image can speak, and the image can cause everybody to be put to death that will not worship the beast. So this image also causes, look in verse 15 and 16, or 16, to be a mark on the right hand. This image can force everybody to take a mark on the right hand or the forehead. And the life was given through this false prophet on behalf of the beast, the emperor. So this image could cause everyone to receive a mark on the right hand or the forehead so that no one could buy or sell unless he has the mark. So the mark of the beast will be 3.5 years before Jesus Christ returns. How long it'll take after they stop the daily sacrifices in the middle of that 7-year treaty, how long it'll take them to set up the image, program it, and so on, and they worship this image and the beast as God, I don't know. They have said there's going to be 3 phases to implementing this new international economic order. Number 1 is to establish marks on all economic goods, your packaging in grocery stores and all items. The second phase would be to put little boxes underneath the main universal product code. The third phase of this implementation of this economic system would be to put beside these other little boxes that would give other information in the computers an F and an H. And now for the first time on a product in the United States of America, fig bars found in Kroger stores now have the F and H on it. The third and final stage. So is the Antichrist dictator somewhere behind the scene waiting to make his move? Oh yes, he is, because once this image is set up in the temple, then the mark of the beast is going to be enforced. Now, we don't know of any 7-year treaty yet, so we know we've got 3.5 years. We know we've got that much. So that's the key. Look for that 7-year treaty, and then once that is come into being, the daily sacrifices are cut off in the middle of that year, then they're going to start erecting this image. And that image can speak and cause everyone to receive the marks to go along with the Universal Product Code for instant transfer of funds. And if we don't worship that image, who is the exact semblance of the beast himself as God, then he can force us to be put to death. So what it all amounts to now is that once this period of time starts and this awful abomination is set up in the wing of the temple, then after 110 days, though that host nation, those Jews in Israel who see that this is the false Messiah and that they are committing idolatry, they're going to rise up because either they're going to worship it or they're going to die. And they're going to rise up and destroy the temple and the sanctuary so they can't offer sacrifices to this new God on their altar. And then the sacrifices will cease for 1,150 days. And then our salvation is going to be here. Let's look up and watch for the 7-year treaty.